Marcus Thompson had been hunting these Wyoming mountains for 23 years, ever since his father first brought him up here as a 12-year-old boy. The familiar weight of his rifle felt comfortable in his hands as he moved through the dense pine forest, his boots crunching softly on the carpet of fallen needles. The morning mist still clung to the valleys below, and the air carried that crisp bite that promised snow before nightfall. He wasn't alone on this particular expedition. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist from the State Conservation Department, had joined him and 2 other hunters for what was supposed to be a routine elk survey. The department had been tracking unusual migration patterns in the area, and Sarah needed experienced hunters to help her navigate the remote terrain while she collected data on herd movements. Marcus liked Sarah immediately. She was smart, direct, and didn't treat the hunters like they were ignorant backwoods folk. She listened when they shared their knowledge about animal behavior and weather patterns. Most importantly, she didn't slow them down. The woman could keep up on difficult terrain and never complained about the early morning starts or the long days. The other 2 hunters were Jake Morrison, a local rancher who knew these mountains almost as well as Marcus, and Tom Bradley, a newcomer from Denver who had more expensive gear than experience. Tom meant well, but he had that eager, slightly reckless energy that made seasoned hunters nervous. They had been tracking a large bull elk for 3 days. The animal's tracks told a story of strength and intelligence. He was old, probably past his prime breeding years, but still magnificent. His hoofprints were deep and wide, suggesting an animal that might dress out at 700 or 800 pounds. More telling were the scrapes on trees where he had rubbed his antlers. The gouges were high up, indicating a rack that would make any hunter's heart race. On the 3rd morning, they finally caught sight of him. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat as the massive elk stepped into a clearing about 400 yards away. The animal's antlers were even more impressive than the tree scrapes had suggested, 6 points on each side, with a spread that had to be close to 50 inches. His dark brown coat gleamed in the morning light, and steam rose from his nostrils in the cold air. But Sarah immediately noticed something that the hunters had missed in their excitement. She pulled out her binoculars and studied the elk intently, her expression growing more concerned with each passing moment. "Something's wrong," she whispered, lowering the binoculars. "Look at how he's moving." Marcus focused on the elk's behavior rather than his impressive size. The animal was indeed moving strangely. Instead of the alert but calm demeanor of a healthy elk, this one seemed agitated. His head moved in sharp, jerky motions, and he would suddenly spin around as if something was attacking him from behind, though nothing was there. "Is he injured?" Tom asked, already starting to raise his rifle. "No," Sarah said firmly. "This is something else entirely." She explained that she had been seeing similar behavior in other wildlife over the past few months. Deer, elk, and even some smaller mammals displaying neurological symptoms that suggested some kind of disease. The state veterinary lab was still running tests, but the preliminary results were disturbing. "We think it might be a prion disease," she said quietly. "Similar to chronic wasting disease, but different. More aggressive in how it affects behavior." Marcus knew about chronic wasting disease. It was devastating deer and elk populations across the western states. The disease attacked the brain and nervous system, eventually killing the animals. But it usually took months or even years to progress to the final stages. What he was seeing in this elk looked far more advanced. "How dangerous is it to humans?" Jake asked the question they were all thinking. Sarah's hesitation before answering told them everything they needed to know. "We don't know yet. With regular chronic wasting disease, there's no evidence of transmission to humans. But this variant seems different, more virulent. The CDC has asked us to avoid contact with any animals showing neurological symptoms until we know more." Tom lowered his rifle, but Marcus could see the disappointment in his face. This was probably a once-in-a-lifetime elk, the kind of trophy that hunters dream about for decades. The internal struggle was written clearly in his expression. "We should report the location and move on," Sarah continued. "The veterinary team needs to collect tissue samples, but that's not our job." They spent the next hour documenting the elk's location and behavior. Sarah took extensive notes while Marcus and Jake made detailed observations about the animal's condition. Tom remained quiet, but kept glancing back toward the clearing where the elk continued his disturbing, erratic movements. As they prepared to leave, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh human footprints in the soft earth near their observation point. Someone else had been watching the elk, and recently. The prints were from heavy hunting boots, size 11 or 12, with a distinctive wear pattern on the right heel. "We're not the only ones who found him," Marcus said, pointing to the tracks. Sarah examined the prints with growing alarm. These are from this morning, maybe an hour ago. The implications hit them all at once. Another hunter was in the area, presumably tracking the same elk they had been following. A hunter who probably hadn't seen Sarah's warnings about the disease risk. Someone who might take a shot at what appeared to be a trophy elk without understanding the potential consequences. They tried calling out, hoping to make contact with the other hunter, but heard no response. The forest seemed to absorb their voices, leaving only the whisper of wind through pine branches and the distant sound of the diseased elk crashing through undergrowth. "We need to find whoever made these tracks," Sarah said urgently. "If they take that animal, they could be exposing themselves and potentially others to an unknown pathogen." Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being the most experienced hunter in the group. These mountains could be dangerous enough without adding the complications of disease and inexperienced hunters making poor decisions. They began following the boot prints, which led deeper into the forest in the same direction the elk had been moving. The tracks showed that the unknown hunter was moving quickly, probably trying to get ahead of the animal for a better shot opportunity. After about 30 minutes of tracking, they heard it, the sharp crack of a high-powered rifle echoing off the canyon walls. Then another shot, and another. Marcus counted 5 shots total, which suggested either a very poor marksman or a very difficult target. "That's too many shots for a clean kill," Jake observed grimly. They moved faster now, following both the boot prints and the sound of the gunfire. What they found when they crested a small ridge would stay with Marcus for the rest of his life. The elk lay in a small clearing, but he was far from dead. The animal was thrashing violently, his massive antlers gouging deep furrows in the earth. Blood stained his coat in several places, indicating multiple wounds, but none appeared to be immediately fatal. The diseased animal's neurological symptoms seemed to be intensifying under the stress of being shot. Standing about 50 yards away was a hunter Marcus didn't recognize. Middle-aged, wearing expensive camouflage gear and carrying what looked like a custom rifle. The man was reloading, clearly preparing to take another shot at the wounded animal. But what made Marcus's heart stop was what he saw between the hunter and the elk. Sarah was running directly toward the wounded animal, shouting something that was lost in the sound of the elk's thrashing and the echo of gunshots off the canyon walls. The hunter raised his rifle again, focusing entirely on the elk. He clearly hadn't seen Sarah approaching from his left side, and with the elk's erratic movements, any shot he took would be incredibly dangerous. Marcus shouted a warning, but the hunter was wearing ear protection and didn't hear him. Sarah was now less than 20 yards from the wounded elk, close enough to be seriously injured or killed if the animal charged in her direction. The hunter's finger was moving toward the trigger when Marcus made a split-second decision that would change everything. He fired his own rifle into the air, the sharp crack echoing through the forest like thunder. The unknown hunter spun around in surprise, finally seeing Sarah's approach. But the warning shot had an unintended consequence. The wounded elk, already driven to frenzy by pain and disease, reacted to the new gunshot by surging to his feet with incredible force. 800 pounds of diseased, wounded, and terrified elk can move with shocking speed and unpredictability. Instead of running away from the humans as a healthy elk would, this animal turned toward them with the aggressive instinct of something that was no longer entirely sane. Sarah saw the elk rising and tried to change direction, but her momentum carried her forward even as she attempted to stop. The hunter who had been shooting was directly in the animal's path, still trying to understand what was happening around him. Marcus was already running toward the scene, his rifle ready, but he was too far away to make a clean shot without risking hitting Sarah or the other hunter. Jake was shouting something behind him, and Tom was fumbling with his rifle, clearly panicked by the rapidly developing crisis. The elk took 3 powerful strides toward the confused hunter, before stumbling, his wounded legs unable to support his weight properly. But those 3 strides were enough to close most of the distance between them. The hunter raised his rifle in what looked more like a defensive gesture than an aimed shot. The elk's massive antlers were lowered as he approached, and even wounded and diseased, he represented over half a ton of unpredictable danger. Sarah reached the scene first, somehow managing to position herself between the elk and the hunter. She was shouting something about the disease, about contamination, about getting away from the animal. But her words were lost in the chaos of the moment. The elk made one final surge forward, and that's when everything went wrong at once. The hunter's rifle discharged, though whether intentionally or by accident, Marcus could never be sure. Sarah threw herself to one side, trying to avoid both the gunshot and the elk's antlers. The massive animal stumbled again, his wounded legs finally giving out completely. But as the elk fell, his weight and momentum carried him directly toward where Sarah had fallen. 800 pounds of dying animal, with 6-foot antlers and hooves the size of dinner plates, crashed down exactly where the wildlife biologist was trying to roll to safety. Marcus reached them seconds later, his heart pounding so hard he could barely hear his own thoughts. The elk was still breathing but clearly dying, his eyes already glazing over with the final stages of both disease and blood loss. Sarah was pinned beneath the animal's massive shoulder, conscious but clearly in pain. The hunter who had caused the entire crisis was standing 10 feet away, his rifle hanging loose in his hands, staring at the scene with an expression of complete shock. He kept saying, "I didn't see her, I didn't see her," over and over. Jake arrived and immediately began trying to move the elk's weight off Sarah, but even in death, the animal was too heavy for 2 men to lift easily. Tom appeared with a length of rope from his pack, and they managed to create a crude pulley system using a sturdy pine branch. As they worked to free Sarah, Marcus noticed something that filled him with dread. The elk's blood had soaked through Sarah's jacket and pants. If the disease could be transmitted through blood contact, she had been exposed to a massive dose of whatever pathogen the animal had been carrying. They finally managed to free her after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes. Sarah was conscious and coherent, which was encouraging, but her left leg was clearly broken and she had several deep cuts from the elk's antlers and hooves. "The blood," she said weakly, as they examined her injuries. "I need to get to a hospital immediately, not just for the broken leg. If this disease variant can jump to humans, I've been exposed to a lethal dose." The nearest hospital was over 2 hours away by truck, assuming they could get back to their vehicles without incident. But they were still deep in the mountains, at least an hour's hike from the nearest road, and Sarah clearly couldn't walk on her injured leg. The hunter who had shot the elk finally approached them, his face pale with shock and guilt. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I didn't know about any disease. I just saw a big elk and thought..." He trailed off, apparently realizing how inadequate his words sounded. Marcus made quick decisions. Jake would stay with Sarah while he and Tom hiked out to get help. The unknown hunter would remain as well, since he was clearly too shaken to be trusted on difficult terrain. But as Marcus prepared to leave for help, Sarah grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Her eyes were bright with fever, and he realized that her condition was deteriorating faster than a broken leg should cause. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, "promise me something. If I don't make it out of here, make sure they test my blood. The CDC needs to know if this disease can infect humans, and if it can..." She paused, struggling to speak clearly. "If it can, they need to know how fast it progresses." The implications of her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah wasn't just worried about her broken leg or even potential long-term disease exposure. She was showing symptoms already, less than an hour after contact with the infected elk's blood. As he started his desperate race toward the road and help, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into something far worse than a hunting accident. Sarah's warning about the disease variant being different, more aggressive, kept echoing in his mind. The hunter had taken one more step toward that elk, despite her warnings, and now Marcus was running through mountain terrain, hoping against hope that he could get help before it was too late to save not just Sarah's life, but potentially the lives of everyone who might be exposed to whatever she had contracted from the diseased animal. Behind him, he could hear Jake calling out updates on Sarah's condition. Her fever was climbing rapidly, and she was beginning to show the same neurological symptoms they had observed in the elk. The disease wasn't just transmissible to humans, it was progressing at a terrifying rate. Marcus ran harder than he had ever run in his life, knowing that every minute could mean the difference between containment and catastrophe. Marcus reached the main logging road after 47 minutes of the most grueling run of his life. His lungs burned in the thin mountain air, and his legs shook with exhaustion, but adrenaline kept him moving. Tom had fallen behind about halfway down the mountain, his expensive gear no match for the demanding terrain and desperate pace. The first stroke of luck came when Marcus spotted a Forest Service truck approaching from the direction of the highway. He ran into the middle of the road, waving his arms and shouting. The driver, a ranger named Pete Kowalski, whom Marcus had known for years, immediately stopped when he saw the obvious distress. "Medical emergency," Marcus gasped out between breaths. "Wildlife biologist trapped under dead elk." Possible disease exposure. Need helicopter evacuation immediately. Pete didn't waste time with questions. He grabbed his radio and started calling for emergency services while Marcus collapsed against the truck's tailgate, trying to catch his breath. Within minutes, Pete had contacted the county sheriff, emergency medical services, and the state health department. The second stroke of luck was that a medical helicopter was already in the area, responding to a heart attack victim at a ranch about 15 miles away. The pilot agreed to divert to their location as soon as he delivered the heart patient to the hospital. While they waited, Marcus gave Pete the full story. The ranger's expression grew increasingly grim as he heard about the diseased elk and Sarah's rapid onset of symptoms. "We've had reports," Pete said quietly. "Fish and Game asked us to watch for sick animals, but they didn't tell us it might be transmissible to humans." Tom finally arrived at the road, gasping and pale. He had pushed himself beyond his limits trying to keep up with Marcus, but his determination had gotten him there. Together, the three men loaded emergency medical supplies from Pete's truck and prepared to guide the rescue team back to Sarah's location. The helicopter arrived 37 minutes after Marcus had reached the road. The pilot, a veteran named Rodriguez who had flown medical evacuations in Afghanistan, listened intently as Marcus described the terrain and Sarah's condition over the radio. "We can't land at the site," Rodriguez said. "Too many trees, too steep. But there's a clearing about half a mile east that I've used before. We'll need ground support to move the patient." The flight medic was a compact woman named Jennifer Walsh who had seen everything in 20 years of mountain rescue work. She loaded a portable stretcher and advanced medical supplies into a backpack that looked like it weighed more than she did. Pete knew a game trail that would get them to the clearing Rodriguez had identified. It would save precious time if they could move Sarah to a location where the helicopter could actually land. The hike back up the mountain was a nightmare of competing urgencies. They needed to move fast to reach Sarah before her condition deteriorated further. But the terrain demanded careful attention to avoid injuries that would only complicate the rescue. Jennifer peppered Marcus with questions about Sarah's symptoms as they climbed. The medic's growing concern was evident in her voice as she heard about the rapid onset of neurological symptoms. "That's not normal for any disease I know of," she said. "Even the fastest-acting infections take hours or days to produce neurological effects, not minutes." They found Jake exactly where Marcus had left him, kneeling beside Sarah and trying to keep her calm. The wildlife biologist was clearly worse than when Marcus had left. Her fever had climbed high enough that she was delirious, and she was experiencing muscle spasms similar to what they had observed in the elk. The hunter who had shot the elk was sitting about 20 feet away, staring at his hands. He looked like he was in shock, repeating over and over that he hadn't known about the disease. Jennifer immediately took charge of Sarah's medical care. She started an IV line and administered medications to reduce the fever and control the muscle spasms. But Marcus could see the concern in her professional demeanor. "We need to move her now," Jennifer said after completing her initial assessment. "Her vital signs are unstable, and whatever this disease is, it's progressing faster than anything I've seen." Moving Sarah to the helicopter landing zone was a complex operation. The stretcher had to be carried over rough terrain while Jennifer monitored her vital signs and adjusted medications. Jake and Tom took turns carrying equipment while Pete and Marcus handled the stretcher. The unknown hunter followed behind them, looking lost and guilty. Marcus felt some sympathy for the man. He had made a terrible mistake, but it was clear he hadn't intended to cause harm. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness during the transport. During her lucid moments, she continued to insist that her blood samples be sent directly to the CDC. She also provided Jennifer with detailed information about the elk's behavior and the timeline of her exposure. "The incubation period is almost non-existent," she said during one clear moment. "If this can jump to humans, it's unlike anything we've seen before." They reached the helicopter landing zone after what felt like hours, but was actually only 45 minutes. Rodriguez had the aircraft ready for immediate takeoff, and Jennifer quickly transferred Sarah's care to the more sophisticated medical equipment on board. Marcus watched the helicopter disappear toward the valley and the regional hospital, carrying Sarah and the answers to questions that were becoming increasingly frightening. If she was right about the disease's characteristics, they might be dealing with something that could threaten public health on a massive scale. Pete was already on his radio, coordinating with state authorities. The diseased elk's carcass would need to be secured and transported to the veterinary lab under strict containment protocols. The entire area would probably be quarantined until they understood what they were dealing with. The unknown hunter, whose name turned out to be Richard Mallory, was questioned extensively by Pete and later by state investigators. He was a software engineer from Colorado who had been hunting in Wyoming for several years. He had all the proper licenses and had been following what he thought were appropriate safety protocols. "I just saw a big elk," he kept repeating. "Nobody told me about any disease. I would never have taken the shot if I had known." Marcus found himself feeling increasingly sorry for Richard. The man had made an honest mistake that was going to haunt him for the rest of his life. But Marcus also couldn't forget Sarah lying under that massive elk, her blood mixing with the diseased animals as her symptoms rapidly worsened. The hike back to their vehicles was subdued. Jake was quiet, processing what they had all witnessed. Tom seemed shaken by his first real taste of how quickly things could go wrong in the wilderness. Pete was busy with radio communications, coordinating the response to what was rapidly becoming a major incident. Marcus found himself thinking about Sarah's final words before the helicopter arrived. She had managed to grab his arm and say something that had chilled him to the bone. "If this disease variant is what I think it is," she had whispered, "then that elk was just the beginning. There could be dozens of infected animals in these mountains." The implications were staggering. If Sarah was right, they weren't dealing with an isolated case, but potentially an outbreak of an unknown disease that could jump from wildlife to humans with devastating speed. When they finally reached their trucks, Pete informed them that the state health department was implementing immediate protocols. Anyone who had been in contact with the elk or Sarah would need to report to the hospital for observation and testing. "How long?" Marcus asked. "Minimum 72 hours, Pete replied. "Maybe longer, depending on what the lab tests show." Marcus called his wife from Pete's truck, trying to explain the situation without causing panic. But how do you tell someone that you might have been exposed to an unknown disease that could be spreading through the local wildlife population? The drive to the hospital was tense. Marcus kept thinking about all the other hunters in the area, all the people who might encounter sick animals without realizing the danger. The hunting season was just beginning, which meant hundreds of people would be in these mountains over the next few weeks. At the regional hospital, they were met by a team from the state health department who had arrived by helicopter from Cheyenne. The lead investigator was Dr. Amanda Foster, an epidemiologist who specialized in emerging infectious diseases. Dr. Foster questioned each of them extensively about their contact with the elk and their observations of Sarah's symptoms. She was particularly interested in the timeline of Sarah's illness progression. "If Ms. Chen's symptoms began manifesting within an hour of blood contact," she said, "we're dealing with something unprecedented. No known disease, including the most aggressive prion diseases, acts that quickly." They were all placed in isolation pending test results. Marcus found himself in a small hospital room with a television, a phone, and a growing sense of dread about what they might have unleashed. The first news reports began appearing that evening. "Mysterious illness strikes wildlife biologist," was the headline on the local news. The story was light on details, but Marcus could see the concern in the reporter's voice. Jake was in the room next to his, and they talked through the thin walls about what they had witnessed. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who had seen plenty of injured animals, but neither had ever seen anything like the elk's neurological symptoms or Sarah's rapid deterioration.
"Do you think she's going to make it?" Jake asked through the wall.
Marcus didn't know how to answer. Sarah had been unconscious when the helicopter lifted off, and her vital signs had been unstable. If the disease continued progressing at the rate they had observed, her prognosis was poor. Tom was down the hall, and Marcus could hear him on the phone with his family in Denver, trying to explain why he was under medical observation. The conversation sounded difficult and emotional. Richard Mallory was in isolation as well, though Marcus suspected the man was dealing with guilt as much as potential disease exposure. Richard had made one bad decision based on incomplete information, and that decision had potentially triggered a public health crisis. On the second day of their isolation, Dr. Foster brought news that made Marcus's blood run cold. Laboratory analysis of tissue samples from the elk had confirmed their worst fears. The disease was indeed a prion disease, similar to chronic wasting disease, but with genetic modifications that made it far more aggressive and potentially transmissible to humans. "We think it's a natural mutation, Doctor," Foster explained. "Prion diseases occasionally undergo genetic shifts that change their characteristics. This variant appears to have a much shorter incubation period and affects neurological function more rapidly than previously known strains." The scariest part was what she said next. "We found evidence of this variant in tissue samples from wildlife across a 3-county area. This isn't an isolated case." We may be looking at the early stages of an epidemic that could affect both wildlife and human populations. Marcus asked the question that had been haunting him since Sarah's warning. How many people could be at risk? Dr. Foster's answer was sobering. It's hunting season. There are probably several hundred hunters in the affected area right now. If they encounter infected animals and don't take proper precautions, we could see human cases emerging over the next few days or weeks. The state was implementing emergency protocols. All hunting in the affected counties would be suspended immediately. Wildlife officials were organizing teams to locate and test animals showing neurological symptoms. The CDC was sending a specialized response team to coordinate containment efforts. But Marcus knew it might already be too late. How many hunters had encountered sick animals in the past few days? How many had field-dressed infected game without understanding the risks? The disease could already be spreading beyond their ability to track or contain it. On the third day, they received word about Sarah's condition. She had survived the initial crisis, but her neurological symptoms had stabilized rather than improved. The doctors weren't sure if this represented recovery or simply a temporary plateau before further deterioration. She's conscious and coherent, Doctor, Foster reported, but she's showing permanent neurological changes consistent with prion disease progression. We won't know the full extent of the damage for weeks or months. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Sarah was alive, which was more than they had dared hope during those first critical hours, but the brilliant scientist who had tried to warn them about the disease risks had become its first human victim. Their own test results came back negative, which meant they could be released from isolation. But Marcus knew their ordeal was far from over. They were all witnesses to what might be the beginning of an environmental and public health disaster. As he prepared to leave the hospital, Marcus realized that Sarah's warning had been prophetic in ways she probably hadn't even imagined. The hunter had taken one more step despite her caution, and chaos had indeed erupted. But the chaos was far from contained, and its ultimate scope was still unknown. 2 weeks after the incident, Marcus found himself in a conference room at the state capitol in Cheyenne, facing a panel of officials from multiple agencies. The CDC, State Health Department, Wildlife Management, and Emergency Services were all represented around the long oak table. Dr. Foster led the briefing, and her news was worse than Marcus had feared. In the 14 days since Sarah's exposure, they had confirmed 17 cases of infected wildlife across 4 counties. More alarming, 3 hunters had been hospitalized with symptoms consistent with the new prion disease variant. The good news, Dr. Foster said with grim optimism, is that human transmission appears to require direct blood contact with infected animals. We haven't seen any evidence of human-to-human transmission. The bad news was extensive. The disease was spreading through the wildlife population faster than they had predicted. Computer models suggested that up to 40% of the elk and deer population in the affected area could be infected within 6 months. Marcus listened as officials debated quarantine zones, hunting bans, and emergency protocols. But his mind kept returning to Sarah, whom he had visited 2 days earlier at the specialized medical facility where she was receiving treatment. She was alive and mentally sharp, but the physical changes were devastating. The disease had affected her motor control and speech patterns. She needed assistance with basic tasks and tired easily. The doctors said her condition had stabilized, but they didn't know if further deterioration was possible. I keep thinking about that moment, Sarah had told him during his visit. When I saw you all getting ready to take that shot, I knew I had to do something. But I never imagined it would end up like this. Marcus had tried to reassure her that her quick thinking had probably prevented additional exposures. If she hadn't intervened, Richard might have shot the elk multiple times at close range, potentially spraying infected blood over a wide area. You saved lives, he had told her. Your warning kept the rest of us from direct contact with the elk. But Sarah's response had haunted him. Did I? Or did my intervention just delay the inevitable? This disease is still out there, still spreading. And now I'm patient 0 for human infection. The meeting in Cheyenne confirmed Sarah's fears. Despite their containment efforts, new cases of infected animals were appearing faster than wildlife officials could respond. The disease seemed to be following migration routes and feeding patterns, spreading through the ecosystem in ways that were difficult to predict or prevent. Richard Mallory was also at the meeting, having volunteered to assist with the response efforts. The guilt over his role in Sarah's infection had transformed into a determination to help prevent additional cases. He had donated money for research and was working with hunter education programs to spread awareness about the disease. "I made a mistake," he told the panel. "I saw what I thought was a trophy elk and didn't listen to the warning signs. Now I want to make sure other hunters don't make the same mistake." Marcus respected Richard's efforts to make amends, but he also knew that good intentions couldn't undo what had happened. Sarah would live with the consequences of that moment for the rest of her life. The state had implemented comprehensive emergency measures. All hunting in the affected counties remained suspended indefinitely. Wildlife officials were conducting systematic surveys to identify and remove infected animals from the population. Veterinary laboratories were working around the clock to process tissue samples and track the disease's spread. But the challenges were enormous. The affected area covered thousands of square miles of rugged mountain terrain. Wild animals didn't respect county boundaries or quarantine zones. And the disease's rapid progression meant that infected animals could spread it over large distances before showing obvious symptoms. Dr. Foster presented projections that made Marcus's heart sink. Even with aggressive containment efforts, the disease would likely establish itself permanently in the regional wildlife population. The question wasn't whether they could eliminate it, but whether they could slow its spread enough to develop effective treatments or vaccines. The human health implications were equally serious. While human-to-human transmission hadn't been observed, the rapid progression of symptoms meant that any exposure carried serious risks. Hunters, wildlife officials, and researchers working in the affected areas all faced potential exposure despite protective protocols. Marcus found himself appointed to a hunter advisory committee tasked with developing education and safety protocols. His experience with Sarah's case made him a valuable resource for understanding how quickly situations could deteriorate. The committee's first recommendation was mandatory training for anyone entering the quarantine zones. Hunters needed to understand how to identify potentially infected animals, what protective equipment to use, and how to safely field dress game without exposure risks. But Marcus knew that education alone wouldn't be enough. The hunting culture he had grown up in valued independence and self-reliance. Many hunters would resist additional regulations and safety requirements, especially if they seemed to come from government bureaucrats who didn't understand outdoor traditions. The political dimensions of the crisis were becoming increasingly complex. Environmental groups were calling for permanent hunting bans in the affected areas. Hunting organizations were pushing back, arguing that responsible hunting actually helped with wildlife management and disease control. Local communities were caught in the middle. Tourism and hunting were major economic drivers in the region. The indefinite hunting ban was already causing financial hardship for outfitters, guides, and small businesses that depended on seasonal hunting revenue. Marcus tried to navigate these competing interests while staying focused on the core issue, preventing additional human exposures to a deadly disease. But he was discovering that public health crises inevitably became political battles, with science often taking a back seat to economic and ideological concerns. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus received a call that brought the crisis into sharp personal focus. Tom Bradley, his hunting partner from the original expedition, had been hospitalized in Denver with neurological symptoms. The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. Tom had tested negative during their initial quarantine period. He hadn't had direct contact with the infected elk, but somehow he had been exposed to the disease. Marcus drove to Denver immediately, arriving at the hospital as doctors were conducting their initial evaluation. Tom was conscious but confused, displaying the same muscle spasms and coordination problems that had marked Sarah's early symptoms.
I don't understand how this happened,
Tom's wife said tearfully. "He hasn't been hunting since that trip with you. He's been here in the city, working at his office." The medical team was baffled as well. If Tom hadn't been exposed during the original incident, where had he encountered the infected material? The implications were frightening. Had the disease already spread beyond the quarantine zones? Were there additional sources of infection they hadn't identified? Dr. Foster arrived from Cheyenne within hours, bringing a team of epidemiologists to investigate Tom's case. They retraced his activities over the past 3 weeks, looking for any possible exposure to infected animals or contaminated materials. The breakthrough came when they examined Tom's hunting gear, which had been stored in his garage since the trip. Laboratory analysis revealed traces of infected blood on his knife and clothing, materials he had handled while helping to move the elk off Sarah. The prions can survive for extended periods on contaminated surfaces, Dr. Stab. Foster explained. Tom must have been exposed when he cleaned his equipment without proper protective measures. The discovery was a game-changer for containment efforts. It meant that anyone who had been in contact with infected animals could be carrying the disease on their equipment, clothing, or vehicles. The potential for inadvertent spread was far greater than they had realized. Emergency protocols were immediately updated to include comprehensive decontamination procedures for anyone leaving the quarantine zones. All hunting equipment, vehicles, and clothing had to be professionally cleaned before people could return to unaffected areas. Marcus found himself back in quarantine, along with Jake and everyone else who had been present during the original incident. This time, the isolation lasted a week while authorities tested every piece of equipment they had used and every surface they might have contaminated. The extended quarantine gave Marcus time to think about the broader implications of what they had witnessed. A single moment of poor judgment had triggered a cascade of consequences that was still spreading. Sarah's warning had been prophetic, but even she hadn't imagined how extensive the chaos would become. During the quarantine, Marcus received daily updates on the expanding crisis. New cases of infected animals were appearing in adjacent states. The CDC was now treating the outbreak as a potential national emergency. International health organizations were monitoring the situation and preparing contingency plans in case the disease jumped national borders. Tom's condition stabilized after several days of intensive treatment, but like Sarah, he showed permanent neurological changes. The rapid progression of symptoms had been halted, but the damage couldn't be reversed. 2 more people had been added to the growing list of human victims of a disease that hadn't existed in human populations just a month earlier. When Marcus was finally released from quarantine, he returned to a world that had changed dramatically. The hunting ban had been expanded to cover 6 states. Federal emergency management agencies were coordinating the response. The military was providing logistical support for containment efforts. The small mountain community where the incident had begun was now the epicenter of a scientific and media circus. Researchers, reporters, and government officials had descended on the area, transforming the quiet town into a staging ground for what was being called the largest wildlife disease outbreak in American history. Marcus found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as one of the few people who had witnessed the initial incident. He gave interviews to reporters and testified before congressional committees investigating the government's response to emerging disease threats. But the attention felt hollow compared to the weight of what they had lost. Sarah, despite her survival, would never fully recover. Tom faced an uncertain future with permanent disabilities. Richard carried the burden of knowing his actions had triggered the crisis. The disease continued to spread through wildlife populations despite massive containment efforts. Computer models now predicted it would reach the East Coast within 2 years if current trends continued. The economic impact was already being measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. 6 months after that morning in the mountains, Marcus sat in his living room reading the latest reports on the outbreak. The disease had been officially named acute neurological wasting disease and was considered one of the most serious environmental health threats in decades. Sarah had been right in ways she couldn't have imagined when she warned them about taking that one more step. The hunter had ignored her warning and chaos had indeed erupted. But the chaos wasn't a single moment of violence or tragedy. It was an ongoing cascade of consequences that was reshaping how humans interacted with wildlife across the continent. Marcus often thought about those crucial seconds when everything went wrong. If Richard had listened to Sarah's warning, if the elk hadn't been diseased, if Sarah hadn't felt compelled to intervene, any one of those factors might have changed the outcome. But he also knew that the disease had already been spreading through the wildlife population before they encountered that elk. Their incident hadn't created the crisis, it had simply revealed it. In some ways, Sarah's exposure and the dramatic events that followed had actually accelerated the response and probably prevented many additional human cases. The long-term outlook remained uncertain. Scientists were working on vaccines and treatments, but prion diseases were notoriously difficult to address. The affected wildlife populations might never fully recover. Human activities in large areas of the American West had been permanently altered. Marcus continued to hunt, but with new protocols and constant awareness of risks he had never imagined before that morning in the mountains. Every time he entered the forest, he remembered Sarah's warning and the split-second decision that had changed all their lives. The chaos had erupted, as she had predicted. But unlike the immediate violence they had all feared in that moment, the real chaos was measured in years and decades, in changed ecosystems and transformed communities. The hunter had indeed taken one more step, and the consequences were still unfolding across the landscape they all loved.